Okay, welcome everyone to the Narkis Street Congregation's Bible study for September 30th, 2021. And we are continuing our Bible study in the Gospel of Luke, hopefully. And we're looking at Luke 14, when Jesus goes to a house of a Pharisee and he has a meal there, and then he heals someone. And we're going to have Gemma, if you could read there the first 6 verses.
Now, when Yeshua went into the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees to eat a meal on Shabbat, they were watching him closely. And there before him was a man swollen with fluid. So Yeshua said to the Torah lawyers and the Pharisees, "Is it permitted to heal on Shabbat or not?" But they kept silent. So Yeshua took hold of him and healed him, and he sent him away. Then he said to them, "Which of you with a son or an ox falling into a well on Yom Shabbat will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things.
Okay. So, we're here in Luke 14, 1-6, and we just read there that there's a couple things going on in this text. One, it's a Sabbath, it's a Shabbat, and Jesus goes to this house of a prominent Pharisee. And there we have a man come in who has swelling. He's suffering from swelling of his body. And Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts in the law, the Torah scholars, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Is it according to the scripture? And it says there they remain silent. And then Jesus goes on to heal him. And then he gives this analogy of a child, and other manuscripts have donkey instead of a child, or an ox falls into a well on the Sabbath day. Would you not immediately pull them out? And in both cases, when he asked the two questions, is it correct to heal someone on the Sabbath? And when he gives this analogy of saving life on the Sabbath, both times the people that are there in the room are silent. They have nothing to say. And to give some context for where we're going forward here in the next couple weeks, including today, the next verses in Luke 14 are going to be built on this theme of eating meals and what it all encompasses, and who you ate with and who you did not eat with in the ancient days. And you could probably argue even today, that was part of your identity. It helped define who you were, what tribe you were a part of. And specifically in Second Temple Judaism, it's defining an identity of purity. So, for instance, if you were to look in Acts 11, verses 2 and 3, talks about Peter has gone up to Jerusalem to talk to the brethren there. And it says the circumcised believers there in Jerusalem criticized Peter, and they said, "You went into the house of uncircumcised men," so those are Gentiles, "and you ate with them." And they're referring to Peter going up to Caesarea and eating together with Cornelius and his household. Cornelius, who is this Roman centurion. So that was a big no-no in the culture. And we don't have time to go into how that story unfolds and how it's kind of closed up there in Acts 15, but this kind of lays a context for what we're getting into here, where it talks about Jesus is going to be having meals with different types of people. And so in this case, in our text today in Luke 14, he's eating with Pharisees. And we know Jesus ate with Pharisees in other places, like in Luke 7, verses 36 to 37, where it says, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Verse 38, as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and then she wiped them with her hair. She kissed them and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. So this first example of Jesus eating with some Pharisees at their house, a woman comes up who is a sinner, and that's an issue, right, for the Pharisees here. Obviously, they consider her impure. Another example is in Luke 11, verses 37 and 38, where it says, Jesus had finished speaking, and a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and he reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. And we've talked about this passage before. I think Brian or Baruch Kavaznika did it about washing of hands. And again, this is another issue of purity. The Pharisee here is concerned about what is the practice that Jesus is doing concerning purity of when it comes to eating, that he's not washing before the meal. And then we have our example today, where he's been invited to eat at a house of a Pharisee, and a man comes in suffering from swelling. And I don't know technically if we would call the man impure because he's suffering from the sickness or not, but I find it very similar in all three of these cases. When Jesus is eating with at a house of a Pharisee, the Pharisees are confronted with someone who's outside of their circle, who comes in the midst of a meal, and they find it offensive. Except here in our passage in Luke 14, it just says that they're silent. So that's quite curious, quite interesting. So we know we have these examples of Jesus eating with Pharisees, people who are kind of like your Puritans of those days. But what is Jesus really famous for is eating with the opposite people, the sinners. And there's quite a few passages that talk about who Jesus is eating with. And Luke 5, verses 29 to 30 kind of sets the table for this, that he eats with sinners. Levi, who was this tax collector, held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, these Torah scholars who belonged to their sect, complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And this is talked about multiple times in the Gospels. Why are you eating with these people and drinking with them? And that would be a whole interesting study to look into what's going on in the culture at that time. Why is there such disdain? Is it specifically because of their careers, or is there more to it? So what are these Pharisees? What are these Torah scholars? And we've had a couple Bible studies before where we looked at the Pharisees, because they've popped up quite a bit here in Luke. And the Pharisee in the Hebrew is parush, and Pharisees are prushim. And essentially the root is coming from separating, someone who separates himself from others, and separating from Gentiles, any source of ritual impurity, or even people who are not practicing what they should be, building that kind of wall of separation to keep holiness, to keep purity. And Jesus, on the other hand, he's eating with Pharisees while he's eating with sinners, and he's obviously making a point that he eats with everyone. He's eating from both sides of the political spectrum. He's eating from both sides of almost any perspective. And so he has a very interesting relationship with these Pharisees and with these Torah scholars, these experts in the law. If you really kind of start to analyze and think about his life in the Gospels, first off, he's invited 3 times there that we've read. He's invited by a Pharisee to come eat with him. That means, that sounds very friendly to me. Sounds like they wanted him to come. It wasn't some like trap or some setup, but it was actually a friendly invitation to come eat. And last Bible study from, I think it was Lois at the end of June, we were in Luke 13, the end of chapter 13, and there in verse 31, it says, at that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and they said to him, leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you. And so there's a group of Pharisees here who, like Jesus, they're warning him, you need to hide. Herod wants to kill you. They're not trying to kill Jesus. They're trying to protect him. And we all know the famous passage there in Matthew 5:20, as Jesus is kind of laying out how Torah and God's law plays into a disciple's life. There in Matthew 5:20, he said, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying that the Pharisees, that these experts in the law, these Torah scholars, they're on the right path. They're not going off the path. They're on the right path. But, and he continues that in the Matthew 23, where he says the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. And Moses' seat was this place in the synagogue, the Beit Knesset, where someone would sit and teach. It was a place of authority. And Jesus says the Pharisees, they sit there in authority in the synagogue in Moses' seat. And Jesus says in Matthew 23, verses 2 and 3, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. And then he says, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. And I think I've said this before, because we throw the term hypocrite around quite a bit, how the Pharisees are hypocrites. Jesus called them that at certain points. But how easy or how natural it is that we are hypocrites, that we all talk a good walk, but none of us can keep it going and follow through all the time. And we fall down and we don't practice what we preach. And so this is just kind of a consequence of being human. And so he's saying, do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. And he has a whole litany of things he has against them for what they're not kind of living up to the spirit of the law there. And so even though the Pharisees, these Torah scholars, they have a desire to follow God, they're on the path that scripture talks about. You want to be on the way of following the mitzvot, the commandments, to be holy, to be sanctified, to be separated from evil, from sin, from impurity. And they are what you would call the righteous of the society at this point. And they're honestly trying. It's still a difficult path. It's still very difficult. And I think this parable of Jesus kind of sums up his main point between the Pharisees and the sinners, between those wanting to be pure at all cost and those who kind of are at the end of their rope because they're as impure as it all comes. In Luke 18, verse 9, Jesus tells this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and he prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. And then down in verse 13, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. And before I just finished verse 14 there, going back to what was the Pharisee saying? He's saying, compared to other people, I am better than them. And I fast twice a week and I give a tithe. Fasting is not something wrong. Tithing is not something wrong. So it's not as if the Pharisee is doing something wrong. It's their attitude. And vice versa. It seems like the tax collector probably isn't going to the synagogue. He probably wouldn't even be welcome. He's probably not tithing. He's probably not fasting. And he's probably taking advantage of people. But at this point in time, he recognizes his sin. And he essentially says, God, have mercy on me. And so I think the difference here, this is what Jesus says the difference is. Luke 18:14. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And I think what he's saying is the difference between the Pharisee and the tax collector isn't about what they do necessarily. It's about their attitude. What do they think about themselves? Do they exalt themselves or do they humble themselves in whatever situation they are in life? And I have I don't know, one day I might write a book on this, but I think this kind of sums up the theology of Jesus. All those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And as we look at the next Bible study and the second Bible study after that, we're going to be focusing on this motto Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So now, I'll throw this out there. Does anyone, today we're looking at Jesus healing a man with this swelling. Recently, we just did a Bible study on Jesus healing someone else on a Sabbath. Do you remember who it was?
Gemma is waving her hand.
Well, I was thinking the man with the withered hand comes to mind.
Oh,
Okay,
Oh.
but yeah, we haven't done that one, but
Oh,
back in Luke
I've done that one.
Luke 13
Oh,
is the woman, the crippled woman for 18 years in the synagogue.
I did that one.
So if you flip back one chapter to Luke 13, starting in verse 10, just to refresh our memories.
Mhm.
On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all.
Mhm.
When Jesus saw her, he called her forward, and he said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" Got some fireworks outside my window here. When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. So if you were able to see my screen at this point, it would be very helpful because I want to compare our story today in Luke 14, verses 1 to 6, and what we just read in Luke 13, verses 10 to 17, the two healing stories in Luke on the Sabbath.
Try it again and keep talking.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh,
So we're looking at the two Sabbath stories of healing, and they're in Luke 14, and then the one I just read in Luke 13. And I want to point out some of the differences. In Luke 13, where does the healing take place?
in a synagogue,
Okay, in Luke 14, where's the healing take place?
at dinner in a Pharisee's house,
Yes. Okay, who is healed in the synagogue in Luke 13?
a woman,
Okay, and in Luke 14?
a man.
Okay, now Jesus heals the woman
Mhm.
immediately,
Mhm.
okay, in the synagogue. But in Luke 14, he asked the question before he does his healing. He asked, "Is this legal to heal on the Shabbat?" And in our story today, there's just silence. He asked the question and nobody answers, and then he heals. Now in Luke 13, he heals the woman, and the response from the people is not silence, it's anger.
Mm.
Right? Like, you have 6 days to be doing this. Why do you got to do this right now? Can't you just wait till the sundown? And in both cases, in Luke 13 and Luke 14, Jesus gives an analogy involving basically animals. In Luke 13, it's, don't you untie your ox or donkey from the stall on the Sabbath and lead them out to give them water? If, let's imagine it's a summer and they're dying of heat. Because what would happen to the ox or the donkey?
Mhm.
They would die, right?
Well, I would say no, that an animal won't die for one day not to be let out. I mean, you could wait one day, but I think that they probably had actually ruled that is that, and to be, what do you call it? Certainly they probably didn't do it before they ruled themselves that it is lawful to let your donkey and whatever be unbound and so it's not just their personal practice that's opposed to what they had. I'm just throwing that out for you. I would think that he's kind of talking about their ruling and not just their personal practice, that they're sneaking their animals out while saying, no, you can't. I would think that they've even ruled that, no, you can do that. And so why wouldn't it be okay for us to I just chuck that in there?
Okay, well,
It
right.
seems to me, though, there's a sort of a build-up, isn't there? I mean, the first one is sort of personal practice. Yes, sure. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like going out, you milk your cows on Shabbat.
Yeah.
Because you've got to. You give them a drink. You take them out. It's routine practice. But
Right.
now he's actually going back to basic law about how, there's a
Mhm.
it ties up with what Gary's saying all the time, which is to do with the attitude
Yeah.
to the law.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So let's put it in this frame, Lois. Right. Water, theoretically, right, we can all fast from water for a day. It's
Every week.
But-
That would be terrible.
there are people who would die if they fasted from water for a day. And you could make the argument there are animals that would die,
That's true.
like a hamster.
That's true.
The smaller you get, the less moisture you have inside of you. Obviously, a camel, they're a whole different
I can do 5.
category.
That's true.
But I
True.
think in Luke 13, it's still in the frame of life and death.
Right.
And if you look at Luke 14, the example, the analogy that Jesus gives is not the water, but imagine they've fallen into a well, into a hole.
Right.
And we all know holes kill people all the time, especially children around the world. And so I'm just going to kind of lead with that idea that we're dealing with life and death.
Yeah. Right.
And so I now want to kind of, yes, the withered hand. Gemma brought up the withered hand. And let's see here. Let me read it. It's in Matthew 12. Matthew 12, starting in verse 14. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep?" Kal v'chomer, right? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and they plotted how they might kill Jesus. And so this is interesting. So who are these Pharisees? And you go into the whole discussion between Matthew and Luke and Mark and their views on Pharisees, and that's a whole nother discussion and study. But just note, they're very angry with Jesus. And so I want to compare this story now with our story today in Luke 14. So Matthew 12's withered hand and Luke 14's the man with the swelling. Both these stories are on the Sabbath. They're on the Shabbat. So where is Matthew 12:9? Where's it happening at? Where's the man with the withered hand healed?
Let me find that.
In the synagogue.
At the synagogue.
Okay.
Yeah. just like we had with the woman who was crippled for 18 years in Luke 13.
Mhm.
And here in Matthew 12, who asks if it's legal to heal on Shabbat?
Jesus.
That's in Luke
No,
14.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah, you're right. Oh no, it isn't. It's the others that,
Yeah.
right? It's not him. Okay.
Yeah, we're
They asked
dealing.
Jesus that instead of the other way around.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hmm.
Is it, they asked Jesus, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And so what's the analogy here regarding the animal in Matthew 12? What animal are we dealing with that's stuck, that's fallen?
A sheep.
A sheep. Remember back in Luke 14, it's a child, or it's a donkey and an ox.
Mhm.
And where did they fall into? They fell into a well. And in
Oh.
Matthew 12, they've fallen into a pit.
Right.
So keep all this in mind.
Okay.
And where I'm going with this whole study for now is this rabbinic idea of pikuach nefesh,
Yeah.
which in Judaism, rabbinic Judaism today, is this idea of kind of watching over a soul, preserving a life. And this is not some, I'm not going to give an exhaustive study on it right now, but the basic idea is that you save human life at all costs, even if you have to break certain religious laws. There's three main exceptions to that, though, and those are connected to idolatry or worshiping another god. You're supposed to give up your life in that case. If you're being forced into sexual immorality, that also is kind of like a line that you don't cross to save your life. And then the other one is murder. If someone's causing you or forcing you to commit murder. And it's interesting in Acts 15 when the Jerusalem church has to decide what to do about uncircumcised Gentiles and if they can have fellowship together, like what Peter did with Cornelius. James, the brother of Jesus, who seems to be the head of the church in Jerusalem, essentially says, you can, this is what we're telling the Gentile brothers, they don't have to be circumcised, but what we're calling upon them to do in Acts 15, verse 20, is telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols. So you've got idolatry here, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. And there is a text here, I think it's Bize, that instead of blood, it might have murder.
Oh.
And so there's kind of the big picture here. Sometimes they call these the Noahide laws. They're related to these laws that come later in Jewish tradition, laws that are for non-Jews, Gentiles. But you kind of have the same idea, though, that what the Gentiles are being called to do is you're not, you don't worship other gods, no idolatry, no sexual immorality, and this no blood, which, meat is related to sacrifice to other gods, and possibly maybe there's some background here for murder in the mix. But pikuach nefesh kind of has that built into it. You can break laws if it's going to save someone's life. And this is all coming from Leviticus 18, verse 5. And we're going to read a little bit in the Talmud, the basis for that. But if you look at Leviticus 18, verse 5, it says there, keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. And so the discussion, the rabbinic discussion that we're going to see in the Talmud is over the whole point of Torah, of God's laws, is to give life, not death. And so then they kind of build this case of, well, if you end up keeping a law, and it brings about your death, that's not good because it's going against Leviticus 18:5. So let's look at some of this. And again, I wish I had the PowerPoint, the screen working so you could read this along. You'll just have to I'll have to send it to you later. I'm looking in the Babylonian Talmud and Yoma 85b. And here's what it says. So listen closely for those who don't have their Talmud out. It's Yoma 85b. It says there, temple service overrides Shabbat. So too, Kal v'chomer, like even more so, saving a life overrides Shabbat, the Sabbath. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah answered and said, just as the mitzvah of circumcision, which rectifies only one of the 248 limbs of the body, overrides Shabbat, so too, even more so, saving one's whole body, like all of your limbs. If you can, like, sanctify this limb that gets circumcised, you need to save and sanctify your whole body so that you don't die. And I don't know, do y'all know the story in John 7 with Jesus? If you got your Bibles, go there, John 7, verse 21, 22. Jesus is doing a healing there on the Sabbath. And Jesus also uses the same discussion, the same idea that we find in the Talmud. He says there, John 7:21, I did one miracle and you were all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses, but from the patriarchs, right? Because who first did circumcision?
Abraham.
Because Moses or Torah gave you circumcision through Abraham, right? In Genesis 17, you circumcise a boy on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat, right? That's, you break the Shabbat if the boy's 8th day falls on a Shabbat. Boaz Kavaznika, his circumcision was on an 8th day. Oh, it was on a Shabbat. I remember. And verse 23 of John 7, now if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? So it's very close to what we just read there in Yoma 85b. And so he says there, John 7:24, stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Okay, so we see the connection there with Jesus and circumcision on the Shabbat, just like healing a body. Let's continue with Pikuach Nefesh back in Yoma 85b. Other Tanaim, these are other Jewish scholars after the time of Jesus.
Very early though.
Yeah, the earlier scholars. They debated the same issue. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says that it is stated, but keep my Shabbatot, Exodus 31:13. One might have thought that this applies to everyone in all circumstances. Okay, so Yossi is saying, if you read it, it means all the time, no matter what. Therefore, the verse states, but a term that restricts and qualifies. It implies that there are circumstances where one must keep Shabbat the Sabbath in circumstances where one must desecrate it, i.e., in order to save a life. Okay, continuing, Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef says that it is stated, for it is sacred to you, Exodus 31:14. This implies that Shabbat is given into your hands, and you are not given to it to die on account of Shabbat. Kind of reminds me of the words of Jesus. Shabbat was given
Okay, for
to the
man,
man.
and man for
That's
Shabbat.
straight from, say, are you still quoting from that same
Yeah,
Talmud
yeah,
passage?
it's still
Yeah.
Yoma 85b.
Yom, okay, and so those are like couple straight from Jesus rationales that they're listing in the Talmud for what they're doing. And so it's straight from his, I mean, they're exactly the same thing, only it's different.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's something to consider. Continuing, I'm still in Yoma 85b.
Wow.
Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel, now Shmuel, he's the guy that really is the important rabbi here for our whole discussion of this particular Bible study. He's in the 3rd century. He said, if I would have been there, so he's about 300 years or 250 years after Jesus. If I would have been there among those sages who debated this question, I would have said that my proof is preferable to theirs, as it states, you shall keep my statutes and my ordinances, which a person shall do and live by them. Where is that coming from? Leviticus, right? Leviticus 18:5, our verse. And not that he should die by the statutes and the ordinances. In all circumstances, one must take care not to die as a result of fulfilling the mitzvot, fulfilling the commandments. So the mitzvot are supposed to bring life. God's commandments are supposed to not cause you to die. That's the overriding principle, unless it's causing you to, desecrate the name of God and leave your faith and reject the Lord through like what we were saying with sexual immorality and murder and idolatry and all of that. So continuing with this, again in Yoma 85b, the proof that Shmuel brought, Samuel, from the verse Leviticus 18:5, it teaches that one should not even put a life in possible danger. So notice this. It's not even like leading to your death, but if it's debatable whether what you're about to do could kill them or lead to them becoming sick and they end up dying.
Dangerous, sure.
Dangerous, yeah, that's the word here, is dangerous. All right. Now, so for all you, everyone out there, hang with me. We're gonna just go one tractate backwards into Yoma 84b. So this is 84b. Okay, listen, and think about our story here in Luke 14, right? We have this man who's got swelling. He's sick. Is he dying? No, he's not dying, but he is suffering. Okay. So here we are, Yoma 84b. Rabbi Matiyah ben Harash said, in the case of one who suffers pain in his mouth, one places medicine in his mouth on Shabbat. And the rabbis do not disagree with him. The Mishnah states that one with pain in his throat should be given medicine on Shabbat because it is a case of uncertainty concerning a life-threatening situation. So medicine that, so you have a heart problem or whatever your situation, it is not wrong. The argument here is it's not wrong to take medicine because you are preserving your life, even on the Shabbat. So listen even more, 84b of Yoma. One heats water for a sick person on Shabbat, whether to give him to drink or to wash him, since it might help him recover from a sickness. And they did not say it is permitted to desecrate only the current Shabbat for him, but even a different future Shabbat. So you can keep boiling water to help someone who's sick and to help them get better. And listen to this. And one must not say, well, let us wait and perform this labor for him after Shabbat. Perhaps he will get well in the meantime. Rather, one heats it up for him immediately. Remember that word immediately.
Yeah.
That's Yoma 84b. And these acts, I'm reading Yoma 84b. These acts should not be performed by Gentiles or Samaritans, but they should be done by the greatest of the Jewish people, the scholars, who know how to act properly. So they're even saying, right, even the people who want to keep the highest amount of ritual purity, you don't get your, what is it?
Goy shel Shabbat.
Goy shel Shabbat. The top
Shabbos
people-
Goy.
Yeah, that's right. The Shabbos Goy. You need to take care of people on Shabbat who need help. Okay.
If it's worth breaking, then you can break it. Don't get
Sure.
somebody to do it for you.
No.
Right.
If it's
Oh,
valid to break it.
That's
exactly.
right.
If it's valid, exactly.
Mhm.
You lead by example, I think, is the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so continuing in Yoma 84b, the sages taught one engages in saving a life on Shabbat. Okay, and the one who's vigilant to do so is praiseworthy. One need not take permission from a court, but hurries to act on his own. How so? If one sees a child who fell into the sea, he spreads a fisherman's net and he pulls him out of the water. If one sees a door that's locked before a child, if a child's locked themselves in behind a door and the child is scared and crying, he breaks the door, he takes the child out. Similarly, one may put out a fire by placing a barrier of metal or clay vessels. In other words, doing a lot of work filled with water to put the fire out on a Shabbat when life is endangered. So even if someone's not burning in their house, but the house is on fire, you put the house out because it could lead to worse damage. And finally, and this is for the Bible study today, similarly, if one sees a child fall into a pit and the child cannot get out, he digs part of the ground out around the edge of the pit to create a makeshift step, and he raises him out.
Right.
And so this takes us back to our passage here in Luke 14, 5 and 6, where after Jesus heals this man, he says, if one of you has a child that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? And so it's very interesting here in the Talmud. I mean, it's hard not to say this is the same thinking of pikuach nefesh, of trying to help someone on the Shabbat, that actually when you help someone, you are actually doing the work of the Lord. You're healing, you're bringing restoration. And I want to close that now with this one little segment from John 5. We all know the story of Jesus healing on Shabbat the crippled man at the pools of Bethesda. There today, it's St. Stephen's Gate, the Lion's Gate here in the old city of Jerusalem. And he heals this man. And it says here the Jewish leaders are upset with Jesus for doing these things on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat. So in his defense, I think it's in verse 16 or 17, John 5, Jesus says, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." And where is this coming from? That the Father is at work till this very day, till this Shabbat day, this Sabbath day. Okay, we all know the creation story.
Genesis, when it says, and he ceased on the Shabbat.
Yes. If you go to Genesis 2, verse 2 and 3, and and you read this every Erev Shabbat before you have your meal, and Vaychal Elohim bayom hashvi'i malachto asher asa vayishbot bayom hashvi'i.
Mhm.
What's it literally say there? God finished his
The
work
work that he was doing.
on
Right.
what day?
On the seventh day.
What?
On
The
this
seventh day.
on the seventh day, on the Shabbat.
What?
Yeah, verse
What? How
very
that's
clear.
impossible.
And
Chapter 2.
Verse 2 is very clear. God
Yeah.
completed on the seventh day.
so here's
He was
what's
doing.
interesting is the Hebrew Bible has this. This is what it has. It's on the seventh day. But like the Septuagint, the Greek translation was like, what? No, that's not right. And they changed it. Or
Oh.
okay, I'm not going to say they changed it, but their translation has God
Yeah.
finished his work on the sixth day.
Oh,
And the Samaritan has the same thing, the Samaritan Pentateuch. And the Syriac also has God finishing his work here in Genesis 2:2 to the sixth day. He finished his work on the sixth day. Because I mean, that's what it says, right? In Genesis chapter 1. On the sixth day, he did his thing, and then he rested on the seventh day. And so Jesus, back here in John 5, is playing on this interpretation of, look, even scripture says that God is still working on the seventh day. He's still creating, he's still doing things. And in this case, Jesus says in John 5:18, for this reason, well, no, I won't, but if God is working, that means God is healing. And healing is this type of creation. I think it's when you are helping someone and you are supporting them, whether they're suffering, and whatever the case is, or they could die. Jesus, the Pikuach Nefesh would say, okay, the core idea of the man has this swelling, he's not going to die today. But Jesus goes even further. And in a sense, he the fence around the Torah that we often talk about, how Jesus made it tighter, like say with murder. He said, well, if you're just angry,
true.
that's as bad as killing someone. And if you're thinking lustful thoughts, that's as bad as sexual immorality. Well, here maybe we could argue Jesus expands the fence further out
That's
to
good.
say, let's there's need for more compassion. And whereas sin, we can have tighter borders around, but when it comes to helping and healing people, our borders need to be more flexible, and don't let our principles choke life, because scripture, God's commandments, are, the most important thing is to bring life, real life, true life, in all of its form. So creation, when God created the world, what did he create? He created life. And so I would say the argument here with Jesus and healing on Shabbat is that when he heals, it's an act of creation, and it's creating life, a new life. And that's also, I would make the argument about the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus talks about bringing God's kingdom, why does he do these miracles and these healings? It's because he is restoring and he's bringing new life.